most of us know someone with an addiction, whether it's an addiction to alcohol, prescription, or illegal drugs, perhaps food, but why and how does it happen? Mike Walsh is a licensed professional counselor. He also teaches at the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. Mike will be teaching a course on addiction along with retired psychiatrist Rick Anderson for lifelong learning of Hilton Head Island. Mike, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is really a complicated issue, addiction, but what about it? Is it something we learn? Is it brain chemistry? What is it?
Well, it certainly can be something we learn, but what we're understanding now, probably better than ever, is that we understand a little bit more about how the brain works and the brain's role in all of this, and more specifically, the brain chemistry's role in all of this. And so one of the ways that's really helpful to understand it, if we're going to treat it effectively, is exactly the role that the brain plays. And that's part of what we're going to be covering in the class.
Well, that sounds great. I mean, so is it an issue where maybe I am born with something in my brain, whether it be brain chemistry that's a little askew or something else that makes me tend toward addiction?
Well, it can be. I think it's important to, one of the questions you asked is this something we learn or is this a brain issue? And I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. I think that there can be some genetic predisposition. Certainly, I think the science is pretty clear on that these days. However, that doesn't mean anybody's locked into an addiction. There is certainly a social component to it. You know, there are certain behavior patterns, again, that can be learned. So it's probably a little bit of both. My sense of the overall science of it is we're understanding a little bit better now the role that both the social end plays and also the role the physical end plays.
An example I would think of the social might be if you grew up in a family where mom and dad had cocktails every night before dinner and you got into that habit as well, or you drink socially but maybe you have drinks every day. That's your environment, or learning it in that environment, and maybe that's partly what plays into you maybe ending up with being an alcoholic or having a drinking issue. Is that right?
Well, partially. I think it's important to note that there are cultures around the world where alcohol is a part of everyday life, and the addiction incidence in those cultures isn't any higher, and in fact, in some cases, is lower.
Really?
So I think what's more important here is when we look at addictions, we look at a biological, a psychological, and a social model. So a biopsychosocial model indicates sort of the best understanding of what's happening here. And I think the psychological components of the meaning we attach to drinking are a big part of it. And I think the folks that get involved with the addiction part attach sort of maybe a different meaning to, you know, the everyday drinking than perhaps some other people do. So I think it's important to know that we've talked about the biological in the brain, we've talked about the social, but it's important also that we talk about the psychological end and what meaning we place on things, because that becomes a big part of especially the introductory behaviors that can lead to addiction.
Oh, that's interesting. So can you give me an example of that then?
Sure. Let me talk very briefly about what we understand is the psychosocial stages of addiction, right? So the psychological and the social end of the addiction process. And in stage one, for example, which is where kind of a lot of us start out our lives, there's substances out there, but they're not primarily what we're focused on. We're focused on the social end of things, and if there is substances around, then it's just incidental. In stage two, the substances are around more often, and you can think of college as an example, or high school as an example, certainly, where there's alcohol around quite a bit, and the substance becomes a part of the meaning that you make of the experience. And in stage three, really the substances are there all the time. It starts to become more about the substance being there than it is about the social end.
So that takes a priority, or that becomes the focal point rather than the social gathering.
Exactly, and that's really the stage. And most people, to be quite honest with you, vacillate between stages 2 and 3 all the way through their adulthood, because there comes a time when you're just out drinking with friends a whole lot, and that becomes a social gathering, and that's great. Or there could be other substances involved too. When in stage 3 it becomes more and more about the substance, that's when it becomes a little bit more dangerous, so to speak, from an addictive standpoint. And then, of course, stage 4, it's the social end is left behind now, and it becomes all about whether the substance is available everything becomes about the substance being there. And then, of course, in stage 5, it's all about the substance to even be able to feel okay.
Wow. I'm curious because being a former smoker and nicotine addiction.
That makes two of us.
Yeah, powerful drug. And I'm just curious, do some drugs become addictive, or do you get to those stages sooner than others, or can they tend to be more addictive than other?
Well, I think that's true. The former Surgeon General said nicotine at some point was more addictive than heroin. And there is some good neurological evidence to indicate that's the case. So yeah, I can absolutely identify that with that as a former smoker myself. I can attest to the addictive nature of that. Certain substances can lead us through that process a little bit quicker because our brains and our neurochemistry has a certain affinity for certain substances, and certainly nicotine is one of those.
Now I have to ask you this. I have found that having to quit smoking, I have tremendous empathy for anyone that is addicted to anything, and if they are able to give it up. Do you find that's true with you too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm familiar with the process of having to have that, and a good example of stage 3 and 4 and vacillating between the two for those smokers who are out there is getting in your car for the first time if you're a car smoker, and then trying to figure out how to drive without a cigarette in your hand, or how to take a coffee break without a cigarette in your hand. It's just sort of adjusting to life without the substance is a part of the psychosocial recovery that comes along with kicking addiction.
Well, this sounds really fascinating, and I know you're going to be teaching on Thursdays, and I believe it's a total of 6 sessions, correct?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay, and we want to let people know we're going to have more information on lifelong learning on Hilton Head Island coming up, and we'll also let you know where you can go to find out more about Mike Walsh's class on addiction, which sounds like it ought to be pretty darn interesting. Mike Walsh, thanks so much for joining us here on the Low Country Report.
Thanks for having me.